If a tree falls in the forest and no one is around to hear it, does it make a sound? Obviously, yes, it's real to the tree, there's birds and stuff that are going to hear the sounds, squirrels, bunny rabbits, whatever. A lot of us know it's an absurd question. I mean, it's some kind of philosophy thing, but deep down we all know that yes, when a tree falls down, it makes a sound. However, I would like for you all to imagine a forest. You're sitting there at the edge of the forest, you're looking out at the trees. Are any of the trees falling down? The answer is no. At least not until I brought it up, right? That's because in imagination land, for anything to happen, you have to make it happen. That fact is at the core of every role-playing game. You can't escape it, no matter how good or bad your players are, whether you're munchkins or narrativists or whatever. That's the basic truth. Imagination land only moves forward when you make it. It's not real. And today's discussion is going to be a little bit more in-depth because it's going to wrap up some of the stuff that we've talked about previously. For example, when I was talking about good characters, I had some of you make comments like, I always play a good character. I can't not play a good character. And I know that you've probably never played a good character because if you are passively playing what you think is a good character, I know that you haven't actually contributed enough to a story to be a really good character. The whole crux of a role-playing game is that everybody is collaboratively telling a story, right? That means that you're not just sitting there letting the GM tell you what the story is. That is kind of a type of game, but usually it's not that compelling of one, right? Like you just sit on the rails and the GM tells you, well, first you go here, and then you go there, and this guy says that, and this guy does this. Usually it involves a lot of dungeons. Typically you would play D&D because that's the best system for that. But no matter how much of a wizard the GM really is with a narrative, it's not going to be that compelling of a narrative because you're not working together on it. I mean, one thing that makes a good book is that the characters have thoughts and feelings and stuff like that you can care about. If you as the players are super passive and you're not doing anything, then your characters have no real thoughts or feelings that you could latch onto. Or if you're a munchkin and you're just trying to gather power and kill more monsters, then your motives make no real rational sense in the context of a world, so that also sucks. Like, don't get me wrong, the GM is pretty much the workhorse for world building and creating motives and things like that. It's a lot of work to be the GM, and many players expect a lot out of the GM for a compelling story. But the players are part of the process, right? They're an essential part of the process. You don't have a game without them. You don't have story arcs without people interacting with the story. And this is such a big concept, it's hard to even know where to begin. I've been racking my brain as to how I want to tackle this subject. I've got good examples, I've got negative examples. So I'm going to start with one negative example. And this is one, I used to play with a group of guys, and I liked them as people, but I hated them as role players. I mean, I still think back on stuff that we did, and I'm still angry about some of it. But one example, one of the first things that this group did that really flabbergasted me as a GM is I did a spoof on the Mountain of Mordor. They came to this gate, and I was like, you gotta go in these mines. I had a wizard there, and he's like, oh, there's a seal on these mines, and a warning says, do not enter, dangerous death. And he like breaks the seal, and he goes, they're always so melodramatic. All right, guys, you guys go through there. You'll be on the other side in like a week. If you try to go around either way, well, the dwarves will catch you and they'll interrogate you, and you're carrying this magical artifact. You shouldn't let them have it. And if you go south, it's a terrible swamp. There's bugs and alligators and everything. So this is the fastest way. I'll see you guys on the other side. I've got important wizard stuff to do. See you later. And the wizard leaves. So this group was really bad about everything that had to do with role-playing, so I'm pretty sure that they discussed this for like 3 hours, because that was kind of their modus apparatus. They were very risk-averse, so they never liked to do anything without having a very lengthy discussion that would always get lost in the woods. Like, they couldn't see the forest for the trees, so they would start talking about the moss on the trees, and then they would start talking about the bacterial culture of the trees. It would get really weird, and it would just get so lost in the weeds that they would accomplish nothing. They would come to zero logical conclusions, and then they would usually do something that was incredibly boring and awful for the story. In this case, after their lengthy discussion, they decided to go through the swamp. And you have to, like, this is a bridge, so you have to remember, like, this is hours of discussion later. And they would fight the wheel. Like, if you tried to have an NPC say something like, well, it's not that big of a deal, let's go ahead, they would jerk the wheel back. And they'd be like, no, and they'd list all the reasons why it was bad. So they say, we're going to go through the swamp. we've got a ranger in the party because this is D&D, and the ranger actually makes it to where we don't have to like survive in the swamp. The ranger just automatically survives in the swamp. We'll all be fine. We'll just fast forward and we'll do a time skip. And I was flabbergasted and offended. Like I had stuff in the dungeon, plot relevant stuff. Yes, I made it clear that the dungeon was dangerous, but I had my tongue in my cheek about as hard as I could. And I was like, so like an adventure in the swamp? Do you want to have like an adventure in the swamp? And they're like, no, time skip the swamp. No adventure, no story, no nothing. It seems like the safest, most optimal option. It was like being sucker punched. I was just like, that, like, really? Like after hours of discussion about the way to go, this is what you want, is the most non-story, like non-interactive, like a time skip. This is going to be 3 months of travel for your characters. You're going to be months behind schedule. This wizard that dropped you off is going to be expecting you and you won't be there. He's going to think you died. And they were like, yeah, but we won't actually be dead because we time skipped the travel and we went around. Like, it doesn't matter. And I said, but it matters to your characters. And they go, no, it doesn't really matter to us though. Out of the game, it doesn't matter to us. So no story, no narrative, nothing exciting, very boring. To me, it felt like a middle finger. And years later, I mean, like I would occasionally bring this up when I was mad with them about something that they were doing, and they would always defend it as like, this was in character. This is like our characters don't want to die, so it feels very in character that we would make this safe, optimal choice. Even though we had to walk through all the mosquitoes and like live on tree mushrooms and stuff like that for 3 months, it was a time skip, so we don't really have to think about how our characters felt. I'm sure that they were unhappy, but as players, we were very happy with this decision. It was in character. It was great roleplay. We're so glad, and it makes me so angry that they would always defend it like that as this like great roleplay decision that they came to logically. I was trying to tell a story with them. I was trying to do something interesting, and they didn't do anything interesting on purpose and then felt good about it. And they didn't just do this one time. Oh God, no. There were other games where things got just as bad. There was one time when I had a big thing and I like gave them an airship and I was like, yeah, it's a little airship. It doesn't have that much range. And they were like, oh great. I leave the area of conflict where all the plot is happening and all the things that you've planned out. We're leaving. And I say, to do what? And they say, to go tell the king of our nation, all the way over here. It was like they were in America and they were fighting like American ghosts or whatever. And then they were like, I'm going to go back to England and I'm going to tell the king about the ghosts. And that's it. That was the whole plan, is they were just going to go tell someone else to deal with it. And I tried my best to make it an adventure, and they just never really like latched on to anything. They just went to England, and then they told the king, and then I ended the game. By the time they arrived, like it didn't, like I was just like, well, nothing happened. I mean, you tell the king, and then like, what are they gonna? Like, it's done. Good job. You're finished. So, yeah, horrible stories. Every story that these guys were in were terrible, except for one of them. There was one story that actually came out really well, and all the players at the table were mad. They hated everything about it. This was a game where I was a player, and the GM said, okay, you guys are going to be superheroes. And I said, oh, could I be like a reformed villain? Like, I want to be like Vegeta. I'm there, and I'm helping, and I'm going to help the team to their objectives, but I'm going to be just crabby and difficult to work with. And the GM was like, that sounds funny, yeah. So I worked everything out with the GM. I figured out my backstory, my relationship to the world, how I'd gotten into this, why I'd been forgiven for my past crimes. It was good, it was fine, except one of the players didn't sit well with him that I was playing a villain, and he kept needling me about, can you really call yourself a hero? Like, are you really allowed to do this? Shouldn't you be in jail? Aren't you terrible? And it wasn't constructive needling. It was just that he didn't like I was playing a villain, and he was constantly jabbing me. Like, he had nothing that he wanted me to do about it. He just wanted me to know he hated it. And because he kept asking that, I responded as the character, and I began to ask, well, what is a hero, really? And I started asking the GM. I was like, well, what do we really do as heroes? Like, we beat people up and we arrest them and then we throw them in prison. But then, like, what do? Like, there's this one prison that neutralizes all superpower. So we put them in there, and then what? They're just, like, in there for life, right? Because the country, the whole federal system doesn't really know what to do with a man who can make fire with his mind. And the more I asked these questions, the more the GM answered and began to reveal that the whole super system was terribly corrupt. It was an awful system, and there was a lot wrong with it. The villain being this kind of like anti-authoritarian, sort of like, I hate all of this, I hate all of you, none of you are good, don't give me this crap that you're like better than me, look at what you do. That's what started to evolve. And because this group was the way it was, I was the only player asking about what was going on. We're in a forest, and there's a lot of trees, and I started asking, well, are any trees falling down? And the GM said, yeah, on occasion. By asking the GM about the world, I was controlling the narrative and gradually shaping it to go in a different direction than originally was envisioned. So the question was asked, are you really heroes? The gauntlet was thrown down. And in my perspective, there should have been a narrative response. I mean, these other players had all the opportunity to influence the narrative by asking their own questions and taking their own actions. But they weren't those type of players. And the one who kept needling me, he just crossed his arms and said, no, the system is good. I'm a part of the system. I'm good. Therefore, it's a good system. And eventually what happened was it turned out that the players who decided to just not ask the questions and sit there and work with the narrative wherever it went, they had no influence over anything, and they became villains. Because I just kept asking, what's good about the world that we're creating? Why are we good? And my character was the only one who really wound up having an arc where I went from this reformed villain to being a sort of passionate anti-hero who hated the prison system. And actually the way that things eventually worked out was I destroyed the prison and set all the prisoners free because their life sentences were patently unfair. And it wasn't like a wholly good action. There was a lot of nuance to that, but it followed the villain's perspective of like, I wouldn't want to be locked up there. I've done some evil, but also look at all the positive that I've done, even though much of the positive I've done is based on spite and personal gain. It was a profoundly flawed character. He had like family issues, and by the end of the game, I had worked out my family issues. I hadn't really solved them. I hadn't been forgiven by my family, but I made amends as well as my evil character could. Like, he complimented his son's cooking and told him he would make a great chef. And without going into tons of backstory, this was like a profound moment in my character's life. He never said a nice thing to his son, ever. And what's funny is that I actually didn't want to have a good ending for this character. I tried to talk the GM into letting me retire the character for him to play as a villain that the party would kill. Because it was clear that the other players wanted to sit passively and just be part of the system. So I thought that since everybody else that's the direction they want to go, we should have them just defeat my character, who represents a challenge to this kind of status quo. But the problem was that still left the other players as villains because I'd already asked too many questions and we couldn't really put the genie back in the bottle. So the GM was like, no, just keep going. I'm gonna salvage this. I'm gonna fix it. And he couldn't, because the other players just never gave back. And that's where I'm really going with all this, is that the GM alone, there was no way for him to fix this and make the other players good guys without the other players also creating their own narrative elements. It turned out that here we were in a corrupt system and we had to have opinions on it, and the other players just chose to do nothing about it and blamed external factors. In fact, one of them actually went even worse. He doubled down and began to defend the money that he was making for being a superhero. It was kind of funny. He was more evil than my villain was by the end of the game, and the players in the game were all just pissed when it got to that point. They were like, why? How did this happen? Why weren't we heroes? We wrote hero down on the character sheet. Lawful good. Okay? Lawful good. Why? And they blamed me. I was one of the external factors that had made them evil. That was one of the last games that I ever played with that group. It wasn't working. They weren't having fun, and I wasn't having fun. I didn't like the GM for them. I would create situations, and I'd say, all right, guys, it's up to you. there's a race, right? You got to get a race to this objective, and there's other enemies that are trying to beat you to it, and they'd say, well, it sounds dangerous. We go into hiding. And anytime I gave them an open objective like that, they would always fail it, because they would just wait for me to construct the entire story around them. There was no collaboration. And their stories always sucked because of it. Their characters never really developed very much. Nothing ever really happened. If I didn't tell them specifically where to go and what to do, then they didn't go anywhere. They didn't really do anything. Now, part of this did come from risk aversion, and here's one of the things about that. Because it's a fictional world, the risks that you're facing are the ones that the GM has already thought of, or the ones that you as players bring up yourselves. In fact, one of my favorite things is to have players sit down and be like, hold on, guys, I've just had a terrible thought. And it's something that's like interesting and sounds very correct. And so then, you didn't think of it as the GM, but you go, you know what? That's totally coming for you. You're right. That guy's right. This actually happens. This is one reason why I think that groups that are risk-averse actually wind up in worse situations more often than groups that don't think about the risks very often. Because, once again, you're looking at a forest. Does a tree fall down? Not unless you say it does. Not unless somebody thinks about it. So without a 3-hour discussion, what's behind a door is only what the GM has put there. But if you talk for 3 hours about the bacterial cultures that might arise, well then theoretically, I don't know, maybe there is black mold in the dungeon. I hadn't thought of that, but I guess it's something that we can take into consideration if the players feel like this needs to be a part of the adventure. And that was another thing that was odd about the group, is they spent so much time talking about everything that could go wrong and trying to assess the risks. I mean, a lot of it I would just completely disregard because it would slow the game down so much to have them get, respiratory gear to protect them from the black mold in the dungeon. But other times, they were just setting themselves up for failure by discussing so much of what could go wrong and kind of setting it up. And not only that, making me angry as the GM because I had to sit through another multi-hour risk assessment discussion. So you know what? Okay, fine. Yeah, you go in the dungeon and the black mold kills you. I'm angry. I'm not having fun. Now, this was a particular insidious form of problem because unlike, for example, a munchkin, munchkins are right in your face. They're doing everything wrong, but boisterously. So you get it. It's just oh, okay, this is a problem. But when all these guys are your friends, and the main drawback is that they're just trying not to tell a story as hard as they can, for a while, people have to learn how to do this narrative stuff. It's challenging. I mean, it's improv, there's character acting. If you're looking for really high quality roleplay with a compelling story, it can take a while for everyone to really wade into it and kind of grasp it. So you kind of got to wait for a while and see well, maybe they're going to get over the risk aversion and they'll start doing things that are more fun. But not these guys. These guys were just psychologically not able. I gave it, I don't know, years. Actually years I played with them. And they never got there. They weren't gonna. It was a relief to me when I finally left that group. Because I found some other role players who really wanted to do more narrative stuff. And they weren't trained up on it. A lot of them hadn't roleplayed before. But they wanted the same kind of experience that I wanted. And that's important for putting together a group where everyone has fun. So I often give negative examples in these things because on your way to putting together a really good group, you do tend to run into a lot of negative examples. Like I mentioned, good character role players, really good narrative type guys who can stay in kayfabe all the time, they're harder to find. And even the ones who can do it, they have to kind of learn to do it. So you might find guys that are good, but they may not be top notch right away. You got to give it time. You got to play some games, you get a flow, figure each other out, Eventually, though, you start to feel out character dynamics that work, that everybody enjoys playing. So I do have positive examples, thankfully. One of them actually comes from my We Will Not Play D&D group. That podcast, it's fictional, but it's based on real role-playing games. So I play with those guys on the regular now. And we had this game called Salt Flats. It was set in Utah after the lake had dried up. It was post-apocalyptic, kind of Fallout inspired. And there were 3 of us playing the game. 1 GM. One player was Jerry, who was an enormous 10-foot gorilla man with a giant sword made out of salt. Jerry was well-meaning, but incredibly dangerous. The other player was I, who was a little mutant squirrel guy with giant eyeballs. He could see incredible distances and was very sneaky because he was like a tiny rodent. He could get into tight places, such as, for example, a car engine, and could do considerable sabotage damage at just about any time. I played Peter Penman, who wound up being the face of the group, And we had just this wonderful character dynamic in this game that we all found a lot of fun. Jerry was kind of destructive, but meant well. Just running around the city, he could accidentally make potholes, and then we would stop and try to patch them over and apologize, and we didn't always do a good job with the patching, but we meant well. And then I and Peter, my character, were constantly at odds. Peter had this thing about collecting lawnmowers, and I had one time chewed up one of the pull cords that he'd gotten. Lawnmowers don't exist anymore, there's barely any water, nobody has a lawn. But I was also incredibly useful, so we fought a lot, but then I would have to, coax I into doing something, I'll give you, a whole loaf of bread if you'll go up on that wall and have a look around, I. And then if you could do me the favor and just fall down to your death after you're done looking around, that would be great. It was loads of fun. It was a 3-man comedy troupe. Everybody had their own things that they were adding to the group that made it work really well. It's the type of thing that I look for. And the GM, he'd actually run this game before, but with a less narratively focused group. So he ran into an interesting phenomenon. The less narrative group had just followed his plot hooks to the letter. He said, this is where you should go, and this is what's going on. And they would go there, do the thing he said, wrap everything up, and then pack it in, and basically learn nothing about the surrounding area except for what the GM had anticipated. Meanwhile, our narrative group would come into town, and everybody would stay in character, we'd be doing this 3-man act, and we would start asking questions, which reshaped everything every time. For example, one of the hooks was that an important water filter was stolen, and before we left, I asked, hey, what if we just pay a ransom on it? That would probably be a lot faster. And the GM hadn't considered this, so he had to say, well, I guess we can allow for a ransom. I guess that makes sense. Yes, that's better than killing people. And I said, yeah, all right. Well, we'll let them know that we could do the ransom. So when we got to the town where the water filter had been taken, it turned out that their entire economy was based on crime. But I was trying to pay this ransom, so I was just like, hey, have you seen some guys come in with a water filter? There's not very many of those. And they kept telling me to go talk to Ralph or something. And it turned out that this was an I'm a friend of Dorothy thing, because every time we went to this location where they said Ralph was, they'd give us another location. We went clear across town, we went to a post-apocalyptic Denny's, and they were like, oh yeah, Ralph now works for this hairstylist. And so finally, I get to the hairstylist, and I'm like, who is Ralph? What is going on? And the hairstylist is like, oh, there is no Ralph. Whenever someone's looking for something criminal, we just try to misdirect them, because no one wants to be killed by any of the criminals in town. And I was like, everyone is in on this? Absolutely everyone? And he's like, yeah, everybody. I'm like, the Denny's waitress told us to look for Ralph. And you're telling us to look for Ralph? What are you... He's like, well, I'm the one who's admitting that it's not real. And I'm like, yeah, but why? Why are you doing it? We're asking questions. We're prying. Explain the world. I'm like, what do you eat? Where are you getting food? If all you do is crime, what's your primary export? How do you make money? And they're like, through crime. And I said, well, all right, well, you have to be importing food too then, don't you? And we just got into all this. These things that you're not normally supposed to ask. What is your tax plan? And I hadn't, expected I was going to be asking that, but I got jerked around by this, friend of Dorothy thing for so long. Eventually, I was just like, how does your society work? If somebody is going to drop off food and they need to find the person buying the food, do you just tell them to look for Ralph? How do you get shipments from anywhere else? The GM had not considered this. And afterward, he confessed that he'd felt a little flustered. He rolled with the punches, he did a good job, we had a fun time, it was a great game. But he said, man, I hadn't thought about this. Because he'd come from the school of thought that the GM has to do everything. The GM has to be driving the story and making up all the beats. And if the players find a plot hole, the GM has done something wrong. But that is not the case. We had a great time because everything felt emotionally correct. He just improv stuff on the spot. The hairdresser was like, stop shaking me. I'm just a hairdresser. I don't know our tax plan. And it doesn't actually have to make logical sense. It just has to feel right. When the players are helping to drive the story and they're asking questions and showing investment and they care about, why am I looking for Ralph? It really does kind of flesh everything out a lot more and make it all feel more real and just a lot more interesting. We met that hairdresser. We know him and we know that he resents the criminal stuff. We know that Denny's waitress thought that we might kill her and she was super nervous about us when we started asking questions. And finally, when we did track all this down, we found the water filter. What we wound up doing was we just followed them. We tracked them through the desert. They tried to make a run for it. So we tracked them until they stopped to make camp. And then I ran out there, he chewed up the wires in their car, and then we just waited. They sat out there for hours, they ran out of water, and then eventually we were able to just drive up and trade them that water filter for a few bottles of water. We didn't have to do any combat. And in fact, a lot of times when there was a threat of combat, Jerry was so huge that people typically backed down. Jerry is scary. No one wants to fight a 10-foot tall gorilla. So anyway, as outlandish as it was, and even though Crime City didn't really have a plan in place that made it work, just by jerking people around and demanding to know how, why, and getting the responses like, I don't even really know, I hate it myself, it gave it all a feeling of authenticity that you didn't get from someone who just walks into the warehouse and then shoots the bad guys and then walks out with the water filter. It also establishes really clearly who these characters are and what they're about, what matters to them. And you know, Peter Penman, I would say that was he a good guy? I don't know, but he was interested in people and was trying to resolve things in a nonviolent way. Granted, depriving people of water and then trading them, life or death, is kind of evil in its way. But that's the thing about really being in character and really asking about all the trees in the wood, is at some point you're going to run up into some ambiguous situations where technically you're doing a good deed, but you're also wronging someone else. We did return the water filter to its rightful owners, and we didn't even have to pay a ransom. We got it back pretty much for free. So we were big heroes and good guys to the town that we saved. But those guys who we deprived of water, oh, did they have a reason to hate us? Yeah, we outfoxed them, but they were going to hold a grudge. And that's one of the ways that you get a really good nemesis villain. And it feeds into more roleplay and more story and more interesting action. The GM's original conceit for the boss thief was that he was some kind of cyborg guy, and he was supposed to die or something in the warehouse. But the way we played it out, he lived. And he could live to hate us. There's more to come out of that. We're making our own story. So at the end of the day, I can talk about what the GM needs to do. Many people think that the GM is completely in control and has to do everything. But the truth is, really, you just kind of have to play your audience. Whatever your players want to do, that's what the GM kind of has to go along with. And if you enjoy the way that you GM and the way that your players play, then you can keep playing with them. Otherwise, you kind of have to start fishing for new types of players. We all hear about hack GMs, but there is such a thing as hack players. Alright? You're telling the story collaboratively. If your players are hacks, you're gonna get a bad story as well. And if both your GM is a hack and your players are hacks, then you should focus on hack and slash games and just disregard everything that this entire discussion has been about. Because at the end of the day, if your table enjoys a good Munchkin session, then that's what you're gonna do. If everybody's some kind of passive, insurance salesman, then everybody's gonna sit around and collate papers for hours, and then maybe you'll have an adventure at the last minute. Personally, I don't know how people find that stuff fun. It doesn't resonate with me. I don't like to play in those kinds of games. But your group comes together for your own group's reasons, and the information on, how do I play the best game depends on the type of game that you want to play. I do them narrative. I like them narrative, so that's what I know. That's what I like to play. That's what I have the most advice on, but it's not what everybody does. So in future videos, for example, I could explain why Munchkins are the most pervasive threat to any role-playing game to ever exist, and why they need to be cast into a volcano before they taint everything that they're involved with. But your group might be Munchkins, so it is what it is. But if you guys find this useful, or at least just an interesting perspective to help shape out your games and put a pin into why you feel the way you do, then that's what more videos will be about. So until that time, I hope you guys have a wonderful week, and I'll hopefully catch you for the next one.